Amazing. Thank you, everyone, for coming to the third event of the Critical Food Studies Network this term. We are delighted to introduce Professor Alys Moody, who is going to be presenting a paper entitled The Geography of Hunger Towards an Anti-Colonial World Hunger. Alys Moody is an associate professor of literature at Bard College, where she specializes in 20th and 21st century European, American, and world literature, with an emphasis on modernism and its contemporary and global heirs. She is the author of The Art of Hunger, Aesthetic Autonomy in the Afterlives of Modernism, and co-editor of the anthology Global Modernists on Modernism. Alys, we're delighted to have you here, and thank you so much. Really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Ari, and to Ari, Ashley, and Maria for this introduction, to Ari for the introduction, and to the three of you for this lovely invitation. It's such a pleasure to be here, to be able to participate in your Critical Food Studies Network, which I think is such a wonderful initiative. And I'm very much looking forward to talking to you all about the work that I'm doing at the moment. So this project, I'm going to be presenting a kind of what I think will be about a 20 or 30-minute paper, and that should leave us plenty of time for questions towards the end. I thought, though, it might be very helpful to just kind of give a little preamble before I get into anything. So this research comes from my second book, which I'm currently in the process of writing, on my second monograph, which is about the ideas of world hunger and world literature as they develop in the period from roughly 1945 to roughly 1990, which I'm thinking about, per the book's original title, as the period that kind of takes us from the high point of decolonization to the kind of emergence of third world feminism in the 1980s. The paper that I'm going to give today is sort of a summary in some ways. It was also an early version of the first chapter of this book, which looks at the kind of idea of world hunger as it emerges from anti-colonial thought. And in some ways, the reason that, when I was asked to talk about this project, I thought this might be an interesting thing to discuss with you, is partly this is, for better and for worse, somewhat shorn of the more literary dimensions. One thing I'm interested in doing here is really theorizing the idea of world literature, but I'm also really interested in theorizing the idea of world hunger as it kind of develops and emerges. And I thought for an interdisciplinary audience, this would be a great thing to discuss. But to some extent, I think one of the main interventions that I want to make in this book really comes in this chapter, which is an intervention into the idea of what we think of when we think of the term world hunger, which, I'm sure you all have your own ideas. In my experience of talking about this for far too many years, a lot of those ideas that kind of, take us to the high points of such cultural landmarks as Band-Aids. Do they know it's Christmas, which I hear tragically is about to have a 40th anniversary re-release. Or the We Are the World, also a charity single by USA for Africa around the same time in the mid-1980s. And we often think of the idea of world hunger as being this really sentimental, depoliticizing idea that is very much about a kind of a modes of kind of often pretty condescending and paternalistic kind of global relation where we, kind of position ourselves as, rich Westerners who are going to go out and be nice to the poor, starving Africans. I think that this is obviously it's a really problematic and unattractive kind of political formulation in a lot of ways. But the argument that my book wants to make is that it really is an impoverishment of what the idea meant in its kind of earlier and more forceful iteration. So I think the concept of world hunger at all is a historical concept. It's something that really comes into being with the Second World War and its end. The idea that is that we should care about people, that it is our kind of ethical and moral and political responsibility to care if there are starving people in the world, however distant they are from us, is a very historically specific idea. It comes about through a conjuncture of decolonization, which dissolved a kind of related idea that was often located within colonial networks, especially the British Empire, which since the late 19th century, there had been kind of internal discussions within Britain about what responsibility the UK had to the people that it was basically starving in various of its colonies, but most kind of iconically in India and Ireland. And so this idea, as these empires dissolve, becomes kind of generalized to the scale of the world at a time when there are also massive food surpluses, for a kind of like the first time, especially in the US, coming out of the way that agriculture developed in the immediate aftermath of World War II. I mean, so there's this kind of interesting conjunction of things that makes people start to think across the political spectrum, really, about hunger on a global scale. And there's many more factors feeding into it than just that. And one of the things that I think we often forget in this is that some of these people were quite radical. Some of the people who were really interested in the idea of hunger were not just, US diplomats and politicians trying to develop food aid projects to offload their grain surpluses around the world. They're not just the kind of charities that we now often associate with the term. They were also some of the most kind of important thinkers of decolonization and some of its legacies. So one of the projects that I'm interested in here is trying to recover this history that's mostly forgotten of a kind of a radical leftist anti-colonial account of world hunger. So I'm going to start the talk proper now. But yeah, that's very like, that's the very like kind of high-flying ambition of the project as a whole. This paper is a kind of a condensed account of some of the things that we might find if we start to think about what hunger meant on a global scale for some of the kind of important anti-colonial thinkers of the period after World War II. Okay, and I want to start actually with a very short clip that I'm just going to play because I think there will be no sound based on previous tests. And so I will just play this clip and talk briefly about it. I assume you guys don't have sound, no? Okay, I do. So this is a short clip from the opening minutes of the 1968 film La Hora de los Hornos. My Spanish is poor, I apologize. In English, The Hour of the Furnaces, which is one of the landmark films of the third cinema movement. I'm starting here not particularly because I'm primarily concerned with Latin American cinema, though I wish I was, because it had a very interesting history around hunger. But because this brief excerpt, I think, launches us kind of interestingly on some of the questions that concern me in this paper. I'm particularly interested here in the appearance, which maybe you caught in the midst of this little introductory sequence, of the phrase, the geography of hunger. I should be going, there we are. Which seems to appear in this clip as the culmination, perhaps the synthesis of Latin America's, what I'm translating here as shared past, shared enemy, and shared possibility of the preceding kind of sequence. Surrounded by shots of rebellion and repression, Solanas and Gatinos, who are the filmmakers, their evocation of a geography of hunger seems in this context to point towards a kind of a revolutionary horizon. In this paper, I'm interested in tracing this idea in what will be, I'm afraid, very brief and schematic ways as it traverses anti-colonial thought. The central claim that I want to make is that hunger in the decades after World War II becomes pretty important to the production of an anti-colonial revolutionary consciousness on a global scale. One that eclipses the nation as a locus of revolutionary activity and moves it to the world as a whole, producing forms of solidarity at this global scale. So this is a kind of a claim that people have been making recently, most kind of influentially, I think, Adam Getachew in her book, World Making, which is that although we often think of this moment of decolonization as a moment of real nationalism, and a resurgence of kind of like a kind of a national revolutionary scope, that many of these decolonial movements were simultaneously national and internationalist, that they were really kind of trying to achieve changes in the way the world economy and world political organizations were structured. And I'm certainly partisan to that claim. So to make this claim, I'm going to be providing a brief itinerary of the phrase, the geography of hunger. And I'll end with some reflections on what's at stake in taking hunger as the locus of anti-colonial revolutionary action. It's more like a series of propositions than reflections, if I'm honest. Okay. The phrase, the geography of hunger, you may never have heard of it before, or you may not have known that you have. It's a reference to the work of the Brazilian geographer, Josué de Castro, and in particular to his 1946 book. Again, my Portuguese is as bad as my Spanish, but Geografia da Fome, which was translated into Spanish and published as Geografia del Hambre in Argentina in 1950. So that's where the Latin American, the Argentine filmmakers that I was just discussing are getting it from. Castro was born in Recife in Brazil's impoverished northeast and began his career in the 1930s as a nutritional scientist in his hometown. The geography of da Fome is the culmination of this research, a wide-reaching study of hunger in Brazil, whose signal contribution is an analysis of hunger that sees it as a direct product of colonial relations, especially the concentration of land ownership and the cultivation of monocrops. And this is a recurring theme in this account of hunger, this anti-colonial account. It embeds hunger within both an ecological understanding of the larger environmental changes that arose with colonialism and a socioeconomic analysis of the uneven distributions of land, wealth, and income that colonialism produced. This book proved to be fairly controversial and influential in Brazil and was widely translated and circulated beyond it, though interestingly, it's actually never been translated into English. The link between hunger and colonialism that Castro establishes in this influential work of the mid-20th century was hardly new when he was writing. The 19th century, as I mentioned, saw waves of famines that placed empire, especially the British Empire, under tremendous strain and opened it to a range of anti-colonial and reformist critiques. Ireland and India in particular became sites at which anti-colonial thought and action crystallized around the problem of hunger and famine. But this account of hunger as a mark of colonial impoverishment was still current in the mid-20th century. Yes. Okay, this is just the slides in the slightly wrong order. Aimé Césaire's great long poem, Cahiers d'un retour du pays natal, the notebook of a return to a native land, in one English translation, there's a number now. Sometimes it's translated as a journal. This poem which was first published in its most well-known form in 1947, dwells at some length in its opening passages on what he calls the hungry Antilles. The Cahiers, which embeds hunger at the heart of Martinique's still colonial situation, can be read as a process of kind of racial consciousness formation, which eventually undoes or eclipses these allusions to the famished morns, as he describes them, of the islands. If the Cahiers is a poem of decolonization, then decolonization for Césaire seems to entail an end of hunger, or at least a shift to a different register in which it no longer appears as a defining mark of his homeland. And that seems like a fairly reasonable hope for decolonization on the whole. His move, therefore, in this poem is to supplant the hungry Antilles with a mythologized racial consciousness, with negritude, which elsewhere he argues is the precondition for revolutionary action in the colonies. For many other anti-colonial thinkers at this point, though, the solution is less racial than national, shrugging off the yoke of colonization in favor of national self-determination. But whatever your kind of theory of decolonization, the problem for all of these turns out to be that, practically speaking, neither racial consciousness nor national self-determination, when they came, did actually succeed in ending hunger. By the post-war period, it was quickly becoming clear that the problem was not simply formal political control of former colonies by the formerly colonized, but a larger set of structures inherent to world capitalism itself. World hunger, therefore, emerged as an important, though now kind of forgotten, anti-colonial frame of analysis that helped to register the continuity of colonial structures into what, people had been hoping would be the period of their end. Obviously, the term that we might think of here is Kwame Nkrumah's term, neocolonialism. This is the slide. Here again, I think Castro is instructive, as his early work on a specifically Brazilian politics of hunger quickly became absorbed into an important theory of world hunger. Against the backdrop of a period of work with the UN's Food and Agricultural Organization, which was set up during World War II and which Castro was a kind of an important figure within through the late 40s and into the 50s, Castro published a kind of sequel to the Geografia da Fome in his 1951 study, the Geopolítica da Fome, confusingly translated into English in 1952 as the Geography of Hunger, and then again in the 70s in a Monthly Review Press edition as the Geopolitics of Hunger, which is its more proper thing. This book carries Castro's anti-colonial account of hunger into the emerging field of what was then becoming known as world hunger, the concern with hunger as a global problem that requires a solution on a world scale. Tracing hunger in the Americas, Asia, Africa, and Europe, the structure is very much kind of regional in that way. The Geopolitics of Hunger argues that feeding the world is possible with technological advances and land reforms. And I think that we can see a similar move across a lot of anti-colonial thought, but quite often influenced by Castro himself. So we might turn, for example, to Franz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, which I have up here in a long quote, but I'm highlighted the sections I want to talk about. In the opening pages of this key text of decolonization, Fanon posits hunger as one of the dividing lines that structures what he calls the Manichaean division between the colonists and the colonized sectors. Where the colonized sector, and this is a quote from the bottom, is sated, sluggish sector, its belly permanently full of good things. The colonized sector, in contrast, is a famished sector, hungry for bread, meat, shoes, coal, and light. That is to say, the question of hunger, who goes hungry and who doesn't, is being positioned right at the beginning of Wretched of the Earth as one of the kind of key dividing lines that separates colonized from colonizer. But when at the end of this chapter, Fanon turns to consider the conditions of national independence, he finds a remarkable structural similarity. Across what we might now call the underdeveloped world, he writes, or what they may have then called the underdeveloped world, this is a quote, "The masses battle with the same poverty, wrestle with the same age-old gestures, and delineate what we could call the geography of hunger with their shrunken bellies. Opposite them, the European nations wallow in the most ostentatious opulence." A direct allusion to Castro's geography of hunger emerges here at the moment when formal national independence is revealed suddenly to simply replicate the Manichaean division of the colonial situation at the level or at the scale of the world. The persistence of hunger prompts a realization that the goals of decolonization can't be achieved purely at the level of the nation state, and that the transition to decolonization is no transition at all without a reconfiguration of the world economy. For Fanon, what this ultimately opens up is both the possibility and the necessity of internationalist solidarity. The section on violence in the international context, which concludes chapter 1 of The Wretched of the Earth, and which is framed by Fanon's evocation of the geography of hunger, ends with a program for answering the global structural division of hunger. The solution he proposes is, he insists, not, quote, a hunger crusade against Europe, by which I think he means a kind of program of mass migration to the metropole, but rather a program of global redistribution and reparations that's imagined here as, quote, rehabilitating man as reintroducing man in the world, into the world, man in his totality. And it's a program that he envisages requiring a truly global form of solidarity, not just the third world, but also incorporating the European masses. Elsewhere, he reminds the people of decolonizing nations that, again, quote, the front line against hunger and darkness entails a kind of collective endeavor, a common destiny among the underdeveloped masses. Castro puts it even more starkly, envisioning hunger producing a world split in two between those who do not eat and those who do not sleep, for fear of the former's rebellion. For both Castro and Fanon, then, as for Solanas and Gattino in the film with which I opened, and in fact, their kind of really important Third Cinema Manifesto contains an allusion to this quote by Castro, that the world is divided between those who don't eat and those who don't sleep. But for all of these thinkers, hunger is imagined as a revolutionary force that produces a form of transnational solidarity. So I want to end by considering what's at stake in the figure of hunger beyond its obvious emotional power and its weight as a visible instantiation of injustice. And I'm going to do this by kind of floating 4 brief propositions that we can discuss later or not, if you'd like. So first, hunger viscerally registers the gap between the operations of world capitalism and actual human needs. This has a power that's not so much explanatory or analytic as mobilizing. It points to an acutely painful, a personally and socially disastrous manifestation of capitalism's failures, but it also points to capitalism's failures because this is precisely what capitalism can't do. It can't prioritize in the way that commodities circulate the needs of the people. It can only prioritize what people can buy. Second, it does so in such a way that it makes possible the articulation of a coalition between the various revolutionary classes of the Third World, who all exist in or risk falling into this gap. So this is a huge kind of problem in a lot of left anti-colonial thought, because if you recall your Marx, you may know that he thinks of the proletariat as the only and inevitable revolutionary class, so the working class. But in much of the, formerly colonized world or still colonized world, the proletariat is just a very small part of the overall kind of class composition of the society. Most people are peasants, or they're kind of like unemployed people, what Marx would call the lumpen proletariat, living on the kind of the outskirts of cities, or they are, maybe like small-time traders, which might be like the petty bourgeoisie. And so you have this kind of problem if you're trying to mount a revolution in the kind of colonized world, that there isn't the obvious kind of concentration of what was supposed to be the revolutionary class in a kind of classical Marxist analysis. I'm suggesting that the category of the hungry offers a kind of a way of envisaging solidarity between what become all these kind of like other potential revolutionary classes in this context. It brings together, that is, the industrial proletariat suffering from what Marini calls superexploitation. We don't have to talk about that. Along with peasants, small-scale farmers, and agricultural workers who are all suffering from the worsening terms of trade. This is an ongoing concern through this period. And the surplus population of the lumpen proletariat, unable to earn any legitimate income within the colonial capitalist system within which they're caught. In both colonial and neo-colonial conditions, all these groups are exposed to starvation, especially as subsistence farming disappears through ongoing processes of land expropriation. So hunger can therefore name and summon into being a kind of interclass revolutionary coalition of the oppressed, exploited, and expropriated. It's kind of, in a sense, analogous to the role of the category, say, of the colonized, which I think also does interesting work in something like Fanon. Thirdly, hunger posits a vision of the human that's universal but internally differentiated. It can provide, therefore, the foundation for something that many of the thinkers in this period before 1968 were aspiring to, including and especially many of these anti-colonial thinkers, what's sometimes called a kind of a call for a new humanism. This is something that's been much discussed within Fanon. It's also extremely present within someone like Castro. So it therefore allows writers like Castro and Fanon to elaborate a humanism that's grounded in the kind of universal demands of the physical human body, which has certain kinds of needs, i.e. the need to eat. But at the same time, sharply registers the unjust hierarchical divisions and their brutal outcomes within the human that unequally distribute hunger on a global scale, which is to say, it registers the fact that colonized people, racialized people, unemployed people even are people working kind of in conditions of like super exploitation or other such situations are all much more likely to experience hunger than others. That is to say, it's a kind of grounded in a universalism without making universalist claims in the end. And finally, it registers this hierarchical stratification as both racialized and racializing. In this account, hunger is unevenly distributed on the basis of race, as I've just said. But also in Castro's account, it actually produces physiological and behavioral changes that he thinks are often misidentified as racial characteristics. So this might be forms of laziness, forms of like height questions as well. Other sort of like behavioral outcomes as well. So as a result, placing hunger, the global division between those who do not eat and those who do not sleep, at the center of our account of colonialism has some significant advantages for anti-colonial revolutionary thought. It allows for an internationalist coalition of the colonized that acknowledges the role of race without accepting colonial racial categories. And it takes race itself as embodied, but only contingently so, a product not only of, or not primarily in this account of inherent bodily differences, but of changeable states that arise from the injustice of the world capitalist economy. For all these reasons, then, hunger offers a way for anti-colonial revolutionaries to articulate both a critique of global capitalism and a basis for identifying revolutionary subjects and bringing them into coalition at this world scale. Imagining the division between those who do not eat and those who do not sleep, it promises to open up what Solanas and Gattino see as the shared possibility of a more just world.
Thank you so much, Alice. That was so interesting. We have about 30 minutes for a Q&A, so if anyone wants to either unmute or put their questions in the chat, I'll go through them, but I thought I would start off. I wanted to ask about sort of the second claim here and how you situate, I guess, how you would define hungry and also how you would situate people who are hungry in colonized nations today, or sorry, colonizing nations today. So like America, the West, the UK, and sort of how that situates in this argument.
Okay, great. So the question of how to define hunger, just one sec. Yeah, so the question of how to define hunger is actually a kind of a really interesting question at this point that has both, as many of these questions do, like kind of scientific and political stakes. So historically speaking, when we thought about hunger, we may have just thought simply about people who are starving, that is, who are kind of like on the path to death from a like absolute lack of overall calories. But in the interwar period in particular, this is kind of always an emerging thing, you really start to see the rise of nutritional science, and Castro is part of this, right? That's his background initially. And this kind of starts to draw attention to the fact that, as we now know, absolute calories